Hello and welcome back, future scientists. I'm Mr. K with Mississippi Public Broadcasting. We're going to continue our lessons today on the science portion of the ACT. We've gone through a complete practice test and looked at all the correct answers and talked about how we got there. Today we're going to talk about something a little different. What we're going to talk about is we're going to look at those passages again and try to identify them as far as what subject they are and what type of passage it is. This is going to be really important for some of the things that we do later on throughout this course. One thing that you can do when you're trying to increase your science score is to focus your attention on certain passages. Maybe you do really well on certain types of passages. Maybe you do really poorly on certain types of subjects in the science section. So today that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to go through each passage, identify what passage type it is, what subject it falls into, and then this is something that you can take into the science portion of the ACT, and this might help you focus your attention a little bit more, okay? So thank you so much for being here today, and we'll go ahead and hop into it. Okay, so I wanted to give y'all a brief review and a breakdown of these different types of passages. So there are 6 passages in the practice ACT, okay? Our job today will be to identify the course the passage may be from and what type of passage it is. As a reminder, there are 4 courses the passages may draw from. So you're always going to have 2 biology passages, you'll always have 1 chemistry, 1 physics, and 1 earth and space science. At least 1 chemistry, physics, and earth and space science. Because there's 6 total, you sometimes will get you might get an extra chemistry or an extra physics or an extra earth and space science, okay? So you never know what you're going to get exactly. You know there's always going to be 2 biology, at least 1 chemistry, 1 physics, and 1 earth and space science, but you could have 2 chemistry, 2 physics, and 2 earth and space science. Here's kind of the breakdown on the number of questions you're going to get and the percentage of the questions from the test. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about those passage types in a little bit more detail. So we've looked at these a lot, but I wanted to give you a review of them. So there are 3 passage types on the ACT. One of the passage types is called data representation. There's always 2 passages, 2 of the 6 passages are always of this type. The easiest way to identify these is that they are the shortest. These are sometimes 100 words, so they're very, very short. And they're always going to contain tables, figures, and diagrams, okay? Another type of passage you'll see on the science portion of the ACT is something known as a research summary, and half of the 6 passages will always be of this type. These are middle length, so they're not as short as the data representation, but they're not as long as the conflicting viewpoints. And a really easy way to identify these is that the paragraph headers will often say experiment 1, experiment 2, or study 1, study 2. Because these passages are research summaries, their job is to summarize a research. And a lot of times summarizing research is talking about the specific experiments that were done in that research, okay? The last type of passage you'll see on the science portion of the ACT is known as conflicting viewpoints. There's only ever going to be 1 of these. These are the longest. There's a lot of reading to do with the conflicting viewpoints. And an easy way to identify these is that they have no tables, graphs, or figures. It's just a lot of reading. So what I want to do today, we'll look at those different passages that were on our practice portion of the ACT. We're going to see if we can identify what subject they fall into and what the passage type is. Okay, so let's go ahead and hop into it and see what we can come up with today. Okay, so here was our first passage. Now we don't have to take the time to read all of this because you've already looked at this a little bit and we've justified our answers. This is the one that's talking about the playa and how these rocks are moving throughout the desert, and you can see here there's 3 different explanations. We have scientist 1, scientist 2, and scientist 3, and they all have different ideas on why these rocks are moving around throughout the playa. So take a second and I want you to think of what type of subject this falls into. Is this biology, chemistry, earth and space science, or physics? And then take a guess at what type of passage it might be. Okay? So for this one, here are just a few pieces of information I want to draw your attention to, we can see here scientist 1, scientist 2, and scientist 3. That's a big hint on what type of passage this is. Okay, so for this one, here's what we should have come up with. For passage 1, the subject for this is Earth and space science. Okay, it's talking about playas and different ice formations and some geological questions. Okay, the passage type here is conflicting viewpoints. Well, how do we know that? Well, it's giving us 3 different scientists and their explanation of what's happening here. So the viewpoints of the different scientists are a little different. So there are conflicting viewpoints in this passage. Other ways we could have identified the passage type here is that there's no graphs, diagrams, or tables. It's just those reading sections. Okay, there's a lot to read. The conflicting viewpoints is often the longest, and most of the time my suggestion for students is just to skip this one. This is going to take the most amount of time, and the hardest thing about the ACT is time management. So one thing you might want to consider is just to skip the conflicting viewpoints and save it for last and come back to it if you have time. Okay? Another way we could have identified the passage type here is that it's talking about those 3 different scientists and their explanation as to what's going on here. So again, I would suggest skipping this and maybe moving straight into passage 2 and then to come back to this one if you have time at the end of the test. Okay, so let's look at that next passage and see if we can do the same thing here. Okay, so this is passage 2. Some things to identify here is there is some reading to go along with this, but in addition to the reading, we have a diagram and a couple of tables to go along with it. Okay, are there any other clues here that we can use to identify this passage type? I have a couple here that I wanted to point out. So look at these paragraph headers. On the right there, you can see that it starts that paragraph off saying experiment 1, and then it gives you a little bit of detail of what's going on, and there's a diagram to go along with it. And then it says experiment 2, and the same thing, short explanation as to what's going on, and there's a table to go along with it. Another clue, a lot of the time students don't look at these at all, but they do have useful information, is the footnote. So at the very bottom of this table, it's telling us where these experiments are coming from. A lot of the times the passages in the ACT are real experiments that have been adjusted to make them a little more approachable for high school students. Okay, so this was a real experiment that was done, and it's just been modified in its explanation so that it's a little bit easier to consume. But you can see here where it's coming from. It says it's the Division of Chemical Education. Well, that's going to be a big clue as to what type of subject this passage is. So here's what we could have come up with. Passage 2, the subject here is chemistry. And again, I knew that just by looking at the footnote. It said chemical education, right? The passage type here is a research summary. How did I know that? Well, research summaries often have those paragraph headers that say experiment 1 and experiment 2. Again, a research summary's job is to summarize research. So it has to tell you what the different experiments were and then to describe them. Something else we could have used to identify the passage type here is that it has tables and diagrams. The reading portion here is about a middle length. It's not very short. It's not very long. It's not as long as the first passage was. And then looking at the footnote, like I said earlier, it said chemical education. So that's kind of telling us and helping us identify the subject there. Okay? So let's go to the next one. This is passage 3. Take a second and kind of look at this. So we've got a description of what's going on up top and then 2 figures to go along with it. We have a table and a figure on the right over there. Okay, well, are there any other clues that might help us identify this passage type? Well, I've circled a couple of things here. These are units that are being defined. And so you can see that it's telling us what these units of measurement are. We have micrograms of iron or zinc per gram of paint for dry mass. So a lot of the times that's going to be a clue as to what type of passage we're looking at. What we could have come up with for this one, passage 3, the subject here is biology. Remember that there's always 2 biology sections in the ACT. This one was one of them. The passage type here is data representation. Well, I knew that because the reading was very short. There wasn't a whole lot of reading here. It's probably less than 100 words. It looked really big, but that was because there was a table and a figure. The reading portion was actually pretty short. These data representations will often have tables or figures to go along with them. We just saw them on the last page. And another big hint is that it's defining unknown terms or units of measurement. The data representation have to do that, especially if the units of measurement are not well known. So with all of that in mind, the subject here is biology and the passage type is data representation. All right, so let's go to passage 4 and see if we can figure out the subject and the passage type for this one. So this is subject 4, okay? What are some clues here that we might be using to identify what type of passage it is? Well, we can see that there's a good amount of reading to do here. There's a kind of summary of what's happening up here, and then this is a step-by-step process of the experimental design. So a fair amount of reading, and then there's also a couple of tables and graphs to go along with it. Because I see the tables and graphs here, I know right away that this is not conflicting viewpoints. And again, one of the reasons we're doing this is that it's important to be able to identify a passage because you often want to skip the conflicting viewpoints. So if I saw this as my first passage on the science portion of the ACT I was about to take, I'd go ahead and try to answer these questions because it's not a conflicting viewpoints. So with all of that in mind, are there any other hints that might help us identify the passage and the subject here? So you can see that I've circled a couple things. This is the same explanation as before. This says experiment 1 up here, and then experiment 2 is the second circle kind of there in the middle. And then the footnote that I have circled here says ammonia synthesis. Well, that's also going to help us kind of figure out the subject that this passage might fall into. So let's see what we came up with for passage 4. Passage 4, the subject here is chemistry. Again, the footnote was talking about ammonia synthesis, so making ammonia. That's a chemical equation that's happening probably. Okay, and then the passage type here is a research summary. How did we know that it was a research summary? Well, the headers for the paragraph said experiment 1 and experiment 2. If you see that, it's going to be a research summary. The reading parts of this passage were middle length. It wasn't really, really long like the conflicting viewpoints. It wasn't really, really short like the data representation. There were kind of 2 different sections that you had to read, so it's kind of that middle length. Okay, and then there's also tables and diagrams here, and like I said earlier, the footnote helped us figure out what the subject was. Creating ammonia is definitely going to fall into a chemistry subject. Okay, great, so that's subject 4. I've got 2 more to do. I'm hoping this is making sense, and I'll show you later on in future lessons why this is so important. Okay, so this is passage 5. What's going on here? Well, you can see that there's a description of what's happening. This is kind of giving you some background information on the passage, and then we've got a couple of tables to go along with it. Okay, are there any other clues that might be helpful for identifying these? So this part right here, if you zoom in and really read it, what's going on here in the circled part is that it's telling us what these units of measurement are. So it says Hz, it means hertz, and then this A is talking about decibels per kilometer, okay? So it's defining these units of measurement. That's going to tell us what type of passage this is, okay? So for passage 5, the subject here is physics, and the passage type is data representation. We knew it was data representation because the reading portion was very short, it had figures to go along with it, and it's defining unknown terms or units of measurement. If you see that, that's going to be a data representation. All right, I've got one more passage to do, so hang in there with me and let's see if we can figure this one out. So this is passage 6. What's going on here? Well, you can see that this one actually has a good bit of reading to go along with it, right? It's kind of broken up into these different sections down here. In addition to the reading, there's a couple of tables and graphs that go along with it. So, are there any other clues that might be helpful for identifying this one? Well, you can see here that the paragraphs are being headed with these things that say study 1, study 2, study 3. And then we also have a useful footnote here. Again, this was a real experiment done, and then they took that information and just kind of tweaked it so that it would work for the ACT. But where did this experiment come from? It came from the Society for Experimental Biology and Medicine. So that's definitely going to be a clue as to what type of subject this is falling under. So for passage 6, the subject here is biology. The passage type is a research summary. We knew it was a research summary because the paragraph header said study 1, 2, and 3. There was a good bit of reading to do, but not as much with the conflicting viewpoints. And then it has tables as well. And like I mentioned earlier, the identifying the subject was pretty easy because when we looked at that footnote, it said that the people who were doing this experiment was experimental biology and medicine. So that's going to help us identify the subject here as well if we were kind of confused on that. So this is going to be really important for later lessons. This might help us figure out how to spend that time when we take the science portion. Sometimes we do really well on certain types of passages. Sometimes we do really well with certain types of subjects. And being able to identify those will help us figure out what we want to direct our attention to. You're not going to have time to do all 6 passages, but finding the ones that you have a good chance at getting a lot of answers correct on is going to help increase your score. Okay? Your teacher has some other work for you to do, so make sure to give that your best effort, and I hope everybody has a great day.